Welcome to the Searching for Never Again podcast from the USC Shoah Foundation. I'm your host, Dr. Rob Williams, the CEO of the USC Shoah Foundation, UNESCO Chair on Antisemitism and Holocaust Research, and the advisor to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Today, we're about 80 years since the end of the Holocaust, but we still find ourselves living in a world marked by changing norms, the normalization of hate, democratic decline, the persistence of violence, and rising antisemitism. All of these are a stark reminder that stories of anti-Semitism, stories of shifting political winds, and stories of the Holocaust are more relevant than ever before. Each episode of Searching for Never Again features conversations with scholars, journalists, experts, artists, political leaders, and crucially, survivors, whose stories and work are persistent reminders that the further we get away from the Holocaust, the more important it is to tell its stories. Since 1994, the USC Shoah Foundation has recorded more than 61,000 testimonies of survivors, with the vast majority of those being survivors of the Holocaust. Today, I'm speaking to one of those survivors, the remarkable Dr. Irene Butter, a woman whose story, I'm sure you will agree, is both riveting and inspiring. Here's our conversation. We're joined here today by Dr. Irene Butter, one of the most remarkable people that I've had the good fortune to meet. Irene, as you will learn, came to the United States alone as a teenager. She graduated from Queens College in New York, and then went on to become one of the first women to earn a doctorate in economics from Duke University. She was a professor at the University of Michigan for many years, co-founded a dialogue group focused on Arab-Jewish dialogue among women, and started the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture Series at the University of Michigan. She was married, she raised 2 children, and she wrote a book, which, for those who are watching, I placed behind me, Shores Beyond Shores. Irene, you've been a Fulbright Scholar, a consultant to the World Health Organization, honored with numerous awards for your work, including one just yesterday, which I hope we'll talk about later. And you still travel around the country and the world speaking to students about the Holocaust, about anti-Semitism, and how we should never be witnesses or bystanders. It's a stunningly impressive life by itself, but it's even more impressive when you consider everything that came before that. I think it's perhaps best to start at the beginning. If possible, can you describe your early childhood, what it was like growing up in Germany as a Jewish child in Berlin, the city where I used to live, but before the rise of Nazism?
Well, what I remember about my childhood, it was idyllic. I grew up with loving parents, a brother 2 years older than I, and I had the fortune to live in the same house as my grandparents, my mother's parents, and everybody spoiled us. All I can say, it was an idyllic childhood. I received lots of love and affirmation. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, I was only 3 years old. And I, I learned a little bit, but as a child, my parents wanted to protect us from everything that was going on. So, of course, I saw Hitler Youth. I saw many swastikas. I didn't know what they meant. I perhaps once or twice heard Hitler speak on the radio, but I really didn't understand what was going on. And then in 1937, my grandfather owned a bank which was taken away by the Nazis. Mm-hmm. My father became unemployed, and he decided we need to leave Germany. And he went to Amsterdam, where he was able to get a job with the American Express Company. And then my mother, my brother, and I followed, but we had to leave our grandparents behind, and that was the first really serious disruption in my family. My brother and I learned Dutch very quickly. We went to school, we made friends. For some reason, we knew we didn't like German, so we didn't speak German to our parents anymore. They talked in German to us, and we mostly answered in Dutch. And everything was fine until 1940, when the Nazis invaded and occupied the Netherlands. And then the persecution of Jews escalated. And so that was the beginning of very difficult times.
Well, and you spoke about this the other night. We were together at the Dutch Embassy here in Washington, D.C., where you received the Anne Frank Award. And in your comments, you relayed that experience in a very poignant and succinct way. You said the world suddenly became smaller and smaller and smaller for you and your family and for other Jews. Do you mind diving into that? Because I think it's important to know that happened before. It's also something that we're hearing rather from members of the Jewish communities today who are experiencing different forms of anti-Semitism. The types are different and the conditions are different, but the world doesn't seem as open as it once did.
Well, that's true. I think right now my story is probably more relevant than it has been in previous decades. And when I talk in schools, I point out that my story is an illustration of what can happen to targeted people in a dictatorship, a country ruled by a dictator. So many of the rights and freedom was taken away from the Jews. We had to wear a Star of David on our clothing at all times, so everyone knew we were Jewish. We weren't allowed in parks and in theaters and in swimming pools and many other public places. We weren't allowed to go to the food stores until later in the day. And this was wartime and food scarcities. Often there wasn't much left at that time. We we were not allowed to use public transportation, and then they confiscated our bicycles. So that's how our world became smaller and smaller. There were other restrictions. We were not allowed to visit non-Jewish people in their houses, and they weren't allowed to come to our homes, and many other things that confined us. A curfew every evening when we had to be home. So slowly, the condition was such that deportation and roundups by the Nazis were pretty simple.
And it was more or less overnight, as you remember it. There was no gradual process. The Germans came in and it changed almost immediately.
Right. It took some time to impose all these restrictions, but they invaded in 1940, and the deportation, I think, began maybe 1941, and my family was deported in 1943.
And to pull back just a bit, there are two very specific Dutch questions I have. We'll start with the non-Jewish Dutch who were living among you. How did they respond as these restrictions came, and obviously they noticed what was happening to their Jewish neighbors? Did they express any sympathy or try to help, or was it an immediate change of attitude?
Well, certainly some showed sympathy. When we first had to wear the Star of David, there were Dutch people who were not Jewish and also started wearing the Star of David. And of course, many people were in hiding, and many Dutch non-Jews helped Jews, including my family, to hide some of our possessions. Not a huge amount, but pictures, for example. I have photographs, many photographs of my ancestors and my upbringing, my childhood, which I wouldn't have, except our neighbor was a photographer, and she was willing to keep them for us, and maybe some jewelry, things like that. And I always thought that the Dutch were very protective of Jews, that they were not bystanders. But after the war, I learned that the percentage of Jews in Holland that survived was one of the smaller percentages amongst Western European countries. So, on the whole, I guess things weren't as favorable as I was thinking.
Well, you're right. It's one of the, as a scholar of the Holocaust, it's one of those shocking revelations that I think most of us faced, because we all mostly know Amsterdam, of course, but we all know the Netherlands is a very tolerant society that historically let in different cultures. So our perception was such that, of course, and we would hear, for those of us that follow soccer, the chants, whenever the Netherlands plays Germany, bring us back our bicycles, return our bicycles. So the notion of Dutch resistance overwhelmed our knowledge for a long time of a certain degree of Dutch complicity in these crimes, and it is a revelation. But also Jewish life in your neighborhood in Amsterdam was rather unique and strong. Can you speak about the Jewish community, the people you knew? I know, of course, that you had some relationship with Anna Frank. Can you describe what your life was like at the time of the German occupation vis-a-vis the Jewish community?
Well, we had relatives who had left Germany either before or at the same time we did. So there was family. That was one good thing. We had made many friends in the Jewish community. I remember my brother was bar mitzvah, and so he was bar mitzvah in the temple, and then afterwards we were only allowed maybe, I don't know, was a dozen people or something like that. There was a restriction how many people you could invite to your home for a party. So that was already quite limited. We lived near a temple, and my family was not observant, but we did celebrate high holidays. And my brother and I went to religious school, but after a while, that was no longer allowed, I think, because it was discontinued.
I mean,
We had to go to Jewish schools. We were forced to leave the public schools that we attended and had to go to Jewish schools with only Jewish teachers.
Mm-hmm. And was there a sense of, so I've done quite a bit of work in the Netherlands, and we have a strong partnership with a number of organizations in the country. The Portuguese synagogue was preserved at the same time that so many other synagogues were destroyed, because the Nazis wanted to effectively erect it as a museum of their destruction of European Jewry. Was there a sense of just how special the Jewish community was in the Netherlands that you experienced, or was it the focus at the time was just trying to survive the ordeal under which you and your family were placed?
Yes, yeah, I would say the latter. It was a tremendous challenge. There were a number of different avenues, at least, that were believed to be possible ways of survival. I remember there was a list of applying for a visa to Israel. And I know my father applied to that too, but there was never any movement on that list. And then my father tried to find hiding places for us. He couldn't find a home for the whole family. We would have had to split up. And my brother and I refused. We said we weren't going to separate from our parents. So that option wasn't really there.
Right.
And he applied for Ecuadorian passports because he had gotten a connection from a friend who received Ecuadorian passports from Stockholm. And these passports did not arrive by the time we were deported to Westerbork, but by some miracle, they were forwarded to us in Westerbork, and we were still there. I mean, we were at that point, we could have been deported to Auschwitz, but we were still in Westerbork. We received the passports. They made a huge difference because we became exchange Jews, and exchange Jews had value for the Nazis because they had some plans that they could use Jews with passports from Allied countries for exchange for prisoners, German prisoners of war, or German civilians who had left in the 20s or early 30s for the Americas. And this is what actually happened eventually. Some of these Germans who had come to America were forced to go back to Germany as part of an exchange.
Would it be fair to say, I mean, because this was certainly true in the Romanian case and a couple other countries, that in a certain sense you were almost equivalent to hostages being bartered as part of the war effort?
Yeah, there is some similarity.
Well,
you know, the question was, there weren't that many exchanges.
Right.
Many people who received these passports never got exchanged. And even when we were exchanged from Bergen-Belsen, it was only, I think, 103 people who were included. And that's another miracle. How did my family get included when there were hundreds of people with similar status?
So let's talk about your particular path of persecution. So, you were sent to the Westerbork camp originally, correct? From Amsterdam in 1943. And what was Westerbork? What do you remember of Westerbork?
Well, Westerbork was a transit camp, and adults had to work. The work wasn't very hard labor. Mostly had to do with maintenance of the camp. I myself was too young. I was 12 at that point. We had 3 meals a day. We lived in very crowded barracks, bunk beds, 3-tiered bunk beds. Life was congested, but we were able to receive mail from people, friends. We were able to receive packages if anybody had anything that they were able to spare to send to us. And there was theater in the camp. There was music, very talented performers, Jewish performers, had a chance to practice their arts at the delight of the commandant, who always attended these performances. But what mostly sticks in my mind was the trauma of the deportation from Westerbork, because every Saturday a train a cattle cart train pulled in. The railway track cut right through the center of the camp. You couldn't help seeing that train. And it pulled in Saturday afternoon, and it stood there the rest of Saturday, all day Sunday, all day Monday, this ominous train. And then Monday night, the barrack leaders would turn on the lights and read names off a list of the people who had to board the train early next morning. And that was a terrible trauma because it happened every week like clockwork. And so you had to listen for your name. And if your name wasn't on the list, then you thought immediately, well, next week this is going to happen again. So you live from week to week hoping your name would not be on the list. And so for my family, the luck was that the passports came.
Right. But was there a discussion of where these trains were going? Did people talk about that amongst?
I remember knowing about Auschwitz because when the train came, then people in Westerbork had to clean it.
Mm-hmm.
And they found little notes in the wall of the wagons. And I remember hearing about Auschwitz and gas chambers. I may not have known details, but I knew it was something horrible.
And was there widespread disease or malnourishment for people in Westerbork, or was it relatively calmer than well, your later experience at Bergen Belsen?
Oh, yes, much calmer. Well, I wouldn't say the food was ample, but it was halfway decent. And I think everyone probably lost weight, but not on the scale of concentration camps, starvation. We weren't starving. And occasionally there was a package, and of course that was a big joy. And people got sick. The conditions were not ideal living conditions. And there may have been dysentery and illnesses like that. But on the whole, I don't remember any epidemics.
And how long were you in Westerbork, and how did you find out that you were being forced to be put on a different train?
I think we were there from June to February, so something like 8 months.
Okay. And then one day you heard your family heard their names called.
Well, one day we were notified, just people who had the status of exchange Jews.
I see.
We were notified that we were going to be sent to Bergen-Belsen. They told us Bergen-Belsen is a better camp than Westerbork. And besides, you won't be there very long because you're going to be exchanged. And both of those were lies. Bergen-Belsen was a horrible camp. I mean, it wasn't even comparable to Westerbork. And it took 11 months before the exchange took place. And we were barely surviving.
And well, that's the historical record proves that the Belsen trial revelations in particular show just the levels of brutality by both male and female guards at Westerbork. Very horrific crimes that were carried out there, widespread disease, death, malnourishment for others.
The food rations were so minimal that, in the long run, you couldn't survive.
And as one of these exchange Jews, what was your experience? Was it the same as others who were in the camp, or was it somehow apart?
No, it was the same.
It was the same.
The camp I was in, there were mostly hundreds of people who had passports of some kind. But I don't know the treatment in other camps. There were 8 camps in Bergen Belsen. I didn't know, there wasn't contact. But my guess would be that we were treated as badly as people in the other camps. You know,
But you were segregated into a unit with other passport holders.
right.
Okay. And what was your day-to-day experience at Bergen-Belsen?
Well, it was slave labor for the adults. My parents left early in the morning, 6 days a week. The food rations were, as I said, minimal. There was a piece of bread about 3 inches wide that was for the whole day. And at night, there was a soup made with turnips and water every night, same soup. And that is not survivable in the long run. Then hygienic conditions were very poor, and epidemics developed. Number of infectious and lethal diseases, and a form of torture that was daily was roll call. We had to stand on a big square to be counted every single day, sometimes even twice a day when there was punishment. And it meant standing on this big square in rows of 5 people. You couldn't talk, you couldn't sit, you had to stand in place, rain or shine. And this could take 6, 7, many hours. And one time I saw in front of my own eyes an elderly lady. She collapsed. She couldn't stand up anymore. A Nazi came with clubs and he beat her to death. And that was supposed to be a demonstration what would happen if you sat down.
And you were 13 years old.
Yes.
And the conditions only worsened. I know at one point your mother and brother both became quite ill. Correct?
Yeah, well, my mother and my father, both their health deteriorated. Also, the population of the camp grew, and at one point, 2 people had to share a bed, a narrow bunk bed. So my father and my brother shared a bed, my mother and I shared a bed, and that didn't help either. And it was my parents who became very ill. And my brother, his shoes, he had outgrown his shoes. So he somehow cut out the leather of the toe part of the shoes so he could still wear them. And so his feet were frostbitten. And when we arrived in Switzerland, both my mother and he were hospitalized immediately because they couldn't stand up.
Well, you learned at the same time that you were there about others from your neighborhood in Amsterdam, also at the camp. And would you be willing to describe those encounters?
Yeah, well, there were people we knew, my brother and I both went to school in our neighborhood, and there were schoolmates and friends and people who went to the Jewish schools together and their families. I remember when we were deported in June of 1943, I had a boyfriend, and he didn't show up in school anymore, and so you could surmise either the family went to hiding or was deported. And so I was hoping he would still be there, but he'd already been sent. He and his family had already been sent to Auschwitz. Same for my mother's sister and her husband and other family. You know, they weren't there for any length of time. Some relatives we met in Westerbork, but they were just sent off. Some to what was to can't think of the camp now. My aunt and uncle they died in what was it? No, not Theresienstadt. Can't think of it right now. Many Dutch people were gassed there. But and my grandparents who couldn't come with us to the Netherlands, they were sent to Theresienstadt and died there.
Yeah, in the Terezin ghetto, which was a notorious ghetto that was also manipulated for the Red Cross.
Yeah.
While you were there, you also, of course, had an encounter with Anne Frank, who you knew of when you were growing up in Amsterdam, and unfortunately, you were one of the last people probably to see her alive. Correct?
Well, that was in Bergen-Belsen.
Yes.
I did not know her well, but I knew her through a mutual friend who was in Anna's class and told a lot of stories about her because she was very popular and witty. And so I knew a lot about her, but I didn't really know her. I saw her in Bergen-Belsen, but she and her family were sent to Auschwitz when they were betrayed from the attic. And at some point, they started liquidating Auschwitz, and a large group of women came to Bergen-Belsen. We were not in the same camp, not the same section. We were separated by barbed wire, and we weren't allowed to make any contact over the fence. And so I only saw her one time because we came to Bergen-Belsen February of 1944, and the Frank, Margot, and Anna came in October of 1944. And it took quite a while before we found out that they were in that section because we weren't allowed to be near the fence even. And so one of my friends in living in the same barrack had found out that Anna was there because one time she heard people were talking Dutch. And so she asked, and she found out from Anna that she needed clothing. And so Hannelie, Anna's friend, asked me to gather a bundle of clothing that we would throw over the fence a certain night. And it had to be pretty late in the night when it was very dark. And we could only whisper because the guards in the guideposts, if they saw anybody near the fence, they would shoot. So we met Anna. She was very thin, very pale, and only had a gray blanket wrapped around her. And so that was the only time I saw her. We threw the bundle over the fence, and a woman appeared, snatched the bundle, and ran off with it. So Anna never got it, but many years later, I met Hannelie Goslar in Jerusalem, and she told me that she had thrown over another bundle, and then Anna did get it. But from her appearance, and she told us Margot was very sick, couldn't even come to the fence. So she did not live much longer.
The other night at this ceremony, you mentioned the fact that decisions and fate and sheer luck were all important factors in what happened. And you contrasted your father's decisions with those of Anna Frank's father and
Mm-hmm.
how they led to different outcomes. Would you be willing to explain that to the wider audience? I think it's a really important lesson here.
Yes, well, Mr. Frank, he moved his family into hiding the attic of the building where his business was housed, and he thought that that would be safe. He had employees in his business who had committed to take care of the family in the attic, provide them with food and all the necessities that they needed. So he thought that would be pretty good. And my father couldn't find a hiding place, and so he chose to apply for these Ecuadorian passports. And of course, both strategies were risky. The Franks, I'm sure, lived in constant fear of being discovered. They lived there for 2 years before they were betrayed. And then with the passports, well, that was risky too. How long would it take for them to arrive? Would they be recognized by the Nazis? Would there actually be an exchange transport? Would we be included? All of those were uncertainties. And as I mentioned, the passports did not come before we were deported to Westerbork, and we could have been sent to Auschwitz by the time they finally arrived. So you did whatever you could. You made the best possible decision. But then in the end, Anna's mother died in Auschwitz. Anna and her sister Margot died in Bergen, Belsen, and only the father survived. And in my family, my mother, my brother, and I survived, but my father died on the train from Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland. So he never benefited from the plan to save our family.
Well, let's move to that piece of the story because it's an important one. You did have the opportunity to leave Belsen and to go first to Switzerland. Can you describe how you learned that you were finally going to be leaving this horror, the state of your family at that time, and then what happened subsequent after? Because it's not a straight line to rescue and being hale and hearty again.
No, not at all. Well, one day somebody came to the barrack and said, everybody who has a passport for the Americas or for the United Kingdom has to report to a doctor, a staff doctor, to be screened for a transport that's going to leave in 2 days. And so the screening part, that was already an uncertainty. My brother and I went, and we were screened and approved. Our names were checked. And then my mother had been ill for several months, bedridden. So I had been taking care of her. We tried to get her out of bed and dress her, but she collapsed. She was too weak to make it to the doctor. And my father came back from work a few hours later, and he looked not well at all. It looked like something had happened that morning at work. And only after the war did we find out that he had been beaten. And he was very weak. And so first, we have pleaded with him to come and get screened by the doctor. And he said he couldn't, he needed rest. And then after a while, when he woke up, we pleaded with him some more, and he walked leaning heavily on my shoulder to the station where the doctor screened people, and they asked him, "Are you John Hausenberg?" He said, "Yes." And they said, "Are you ill?" And he said, "No." And nobody could look at this man and think he wasn't ill. Mm-hmm. So then he looked at me and he crossed off our four names of my family. Mm. And it's always been a query, did he really think I was my mother? I was 14 and she was in her late 40s, mid 40s. Did he really think so? Now it's true. We were emaciated. The clothing we wore were rags by then. Mm-hmm. But we'll never know. Did he mistake me for my mother, or was he trying to be human and allow our family to leave Bergen-Belsen?
And you did leave, as you mentioned. Sadly, your father was not well and passed on the journey to Switzerland.
Right.
And your brother and mother were hospitalized for quite a while. While yes. They were in hospital, what happened to you?
Well, I was sent to a refugee camp in North Africa, in Algiers, along with the other people from Bergen-Belsen who hadn't died on the train. There were a number who did die. And we were all sent to Philippeville. It is a town in Algeria, and there was a refugee camp. It was administered by the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association, which I think was a precursor of the United Nations. And they were looking after this camp, which of course was difference between night and day from Bergen-Belsen. We slept in real beds. We had sheets. We had 3 meals a day. We got new clothing. We had freedom. We could leave the camp anytime we wanted to. And it was situated on top of a hill. And walking down the hill, there was a gorgeous beach of the Mediterranean. So I learned to swim there. People were kind, but until the war ended, I didn't have any contact with my mother and brother. I didn't know. And then I received a telegram that they were recovering. And of course, that was a big relief. From there on, we could correspond by letters and hoping to be reunited, but that never happened. I was never able to go to Switzerland, and they didn't come to the camp in Algiers. And so I was in this camp called Jeanne d'Arc in Philippeville. I was in the camp from January to December 1945. And then I was lucky to be included on a Liberty ship. They were ships that were built in 48 hours, not for passengers, but to support the troops in Europe during the war. So they could take 12 people. And after 21 days on the turbulent ocean, we landed in Baltimore. And I lived with cousins of my mother until they came to America. So we were separated for 18 months.
And were you in Baltimore during this time?
New York City.
New York City. Okay, and that's where you reunited with your mother and brother.
Yes, eventually.
And how
But
did you? Oh, please, I'm sorry.
right away, I started going to school,
That was going to
high
be my
school.
next question. Yes, you've led a very illustrative and impressive academic life. I was going to ask if that was important as you tried to process everything that happened and move on with your life. How did your academic career fit into that?
Well, first, I hadn't had any schooling for like
Right, of
3
course.
years.
Sure.
And so I was very eager to go back to school, finished high school, 2.5 years. And then I was so fortunate. The city colleges in New York City were tuition free.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't have been able to go to college because we had nothing. We were penniless. And so my mother would never work. She had to take minimum wage jobs. And my brother took a job right away and went to school at night. I went to school in the daytime and had jobs after school. And that's how we paid our bills.
Mm-hmm.
And once I finished college, well, I majored in economics and I was able to get a graduate fellowship at Duke University. And that's where I met my husband.
Hmm.
And after we finished our PhDs, we spent 3 days in Bethesda. He was a postdoctoral fellow in neuroscience.
No.
And I worked for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System
Okay.
in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm. But then you moved from there to Michigan, so you must have
Right.
liked the cold instead of the humidity.
Well, actually, I don't mind the climate so much.
Mm.
Winters can be beautiful when there's snow.
It's true. It does have a way of covering up all the mess sometimes. But for a long time, you didn't feel comfortable sharing your experience, like many survivors of the Holocaust.
Right. I
What
remember
changed?
in the very beginning, I think I did try to mention something, but
Oh.
people wouldn't listen. They silenced me. And so it took 40 years before I started talking.
Why do you think they silenced you?
I think people weren't ready to hear what had happened.
Do you think
They
it
just
was?
couldn't hear it.
Yeah, I mean, there are differing. I think that your experience is by and large perhaps the most common for survivors who came to the United States.
Right.
There were some communities where Jews who survived from Poland, let's say, felt comfortable speaking to other Jews who survived from Poland, but that was about it.
Well,
And
we also spoke with other friends from the camp if they lived in New York,
I see. Okay.
fellow survivors. We did speak, but not to other people.
Especially was it? I guess my question is this something that non-Jews were just so uncomfortable with that it was
Well,
noticeable?
my
Oh,
own
really?
relatives wouldn't listen.
Really? And then, but 40 years later, something shifted for you. What was that? And
Yeah, well, several things happened. My daughter, she was in middle school. She took a
mhm,
course in public speaking,
mhm,
and the end of the term, she had to give a 1 hour speech, and she chose the topic of anti-Semitism, Hitler's conquest of Europe, and the concentration camps. And she came home and she said, "Mom, will you be my visual aid
mm,
and talk to my class
mhm.
about the concentration camps?" So at first, I was petrified, but then I decided I should do it. And they didn't laugh at me, they didn't fall asleep. So it worked out And then a second experience was that the Anne Frank exhibition came to Detroit. It was in the 80s, late 80s. And I was invited to serve on a panel. And as I was thinking about what would I say, what would I talk about, I realized Anne Frank's voice was silenced forever and I was alive. And so it was my responsibility to tell our stories. And the third was I heard Elie Wiesel speak one day, and he said, if you were in the camps and if you smelled the air and heard the silence of the dead, then it's your responsibility to tell the stories, to be a witness. And if you are not willing, then the victims will die twice. And that had a strong impact on me. So I started speaking in schools, and I'm still doing it.
You are. And just incidentally, I actually remember that exhibition. I grew up in Cincinnati, but my dad was in the car industry, so I went to it when I was 10 or 11 years old. I remember going to that, and it was formative. So you have been talking to audiences for almost 4 decades now, and really, what has been the impact of that? What change have you seen? Have the dynamics of the American landscape shifted in ways that make your story even more relevant and resonant?
Well, that's true too. My favorite audience are middle school and high school students. For some reason, they're not so knowledgeable, and they're very open, and they're very engaged. And I get a lot of feedback. The teachers often ask the students to write to me afterwards, and it's very rewarding when you get that feeling that you've really influenced a group of young people. Of course, I never get to check out 10 years later
Sure.
what they remember, but at that time. And so to have that communication, I've taken it seriously. I am a witness, and I want to keep doing it as long as I can. I met with some Dutch students yesterday here in the embassy, and that was a very good experience.
Well, I can tell you my children aren't so young anymore, but during the years when I was working at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we were lucky enough to have a number of survivors who were on staff and were volunteers. And every one of those engagements really shaped my kids in ways that they still ask me, in my case, my oldest, 10 years later, how is Bob doing? How is Manya, even though both Bob and Manya have passed? It sticks with people. So even though you can't do that follow-up, it makes a huge, huge difference. But you've also written a book,
Yes.
if I dare say, very accessible and engaging book that is not it's not among the more rarefied books that aren't quite as accessible on the shelf behind me. It's something that anybody can read, which is it's so incredibly important. What drove you to pursue the written account of your life, and has the reception been different than your in classroom approach?
Well, that's a good question. It's been distributed quite widely, translated into 4 languages.
Mm-hmm.
I've gotten a lot of feedback from people. I think my main motivation for writing it was that once I'm not here anymore, then maybe someday my grandchildren, my great grandchildren can read about my life and maybe carry on the stories, which is important. And well, it was difficult. It took me 5 years, and I have two co-writers who are very close friends, and sometimes I just wanted to drop the whole idea because it's difficult. But I think I owe it to them. They kept me going. They say, "No, you can't stop. You got to keep going." And yeah, I'm pretty pleased with the reception.
Well, you should be. I mean, I don't say this lightly, and I've read a lot of memoirs. Not as many are as well put together as your own. I think that would be the diplomatic way of putting it. Some are just they're interesting, but they're not as reachable. I think by difficult though, the question I really wanted to ask you said it was difficult. Was it the trauma, the re-traumatization of having to remember everything that made it difficult? And
Yes.
And did you feel? I've spoken with a number of survivors lately who have said, not just in the post October 7th reality, but really over the course of the last 5 to 10 years, they have felt more acutely that their stories not only are more relevant, but the things that they are witnessing on television and in the wider world are dredging up some of the pain of the past in their own lives. This was particularly during the COVID pandemic. There were a number of survivors who felt quite alone and isolated. Is this something that you've experienced yourself? Has the challenging environment that we're witnessing around the world right now made it difficult for you to discuss this, or does it drive you to discuss your history even more?
Well, in a sense, it's more difficult, but it's also more important because it's my impression that many people in our country and maybe others as well do not understand what authoritarian governments, how they can influence your lives, in particular what you might lose, not only your freedom and your rights, but all your belongings, uh, family, relatives who are close to you, and that's what stands ahead of us if we keep going in that direction. And I think it's extremely important, especially for young people, to learn that what kind of world do they want to live in the future, and what power do they have to influence the developments that are kind of written on the wall right now. So it's a matter of educating and also indicating that we all have a social responsibility to build a world that is as friendly and equality oriented as is possible, and especially freedoms and human rights need to be defended.
No, I think we all agree with that. If I may, I think there are two parts to add to it that well relate to you and to many other survivors. I mean, first, there's the simple fact that among the Jews of Europe during the years of the Shoah, children were the most vulnerable and the most likely to die in the concentration camps and the ghettos and the transit camps and all of the other sites of persecution and atrocity. And if you look at everything that you've accomplished over your life, right, being one of the first women to receive a doctorate in economics from Duke, going on to teach at a prestigious university, having a very loving and big family. You've gone on to do a lot. And then you think of maybe nobody knows the exact number, let's say 1 to 1.5 million children who died during the years of the Shoah, what they could have accomplished, but they were never given the opportunity to do so because authoritarianism was allowed to rise. People turned a blind eye to anti-Semitism and violence and deportation and all of the crimes of the Nazi regime and that of its collaborators. Just to think of that lost opportunity is something that can drive people forward. But the other element, also specific to you and to other survivors, we have an obligation, if I may, at least those of us who entered the field of Holocaust studies feel this, to try to help bring about an understanding in a world that you were never afforded. And that should drive us as well. Your stories need to be carried forward because they can help, hopefully, bring about that sort of reality. But what do you think the power of the middle schoolers, the high schoolers, the Gen Zers, to use that term, what do you think their power is? How can they stand up? Because we do see I'll use the term that's been popularized by Viktor Orban, illiberal democracies that are on the rise. How can kids stand up?
Well, I leave 3 messages with students when I talk in schools. And let me say the first one is each person can make a difference. Even if you think the problems are so huge and I'm so small, I really can't help it. I can't do anything about it. That's not true. Everybody can do something, whether it's just one little step or whether you move on to larger projects or endeavors. Everything matters. Everything you do matters. So keep in mind, you can do something. We all have to have the moral courage of action against evil. And the second one is sort of repetitive, but I tell students, never be a bystander. When you see something that is mean or it's unjust or it's evil, don't turn your back. Of course, it's easy to walk away from it, turn your back to it, but we have a responsibility to act on things that are wrong and hopefully make them better. And so I often talk about bullying in schools.
Mm-hmm.
It happens a lot. And so you don't just watch it. You can intervene. You know, you can confront the bullier. You can become an ally of the person that's being bullied. You can ask for help. You can call attention to it. Yeah, you don't want to be bullied. And if you don't want to be bullied, you have responsibility to intervene. And they get it. It makes sense to them. And my third message is refusing to be enemies. Because often we are told that certain people are our enemies. We don't even know those people. And part of that is anti-Semitism, of course, but there are many other isms. And so I think we need to be open to getting to know people who are different from us, to look into their eyes and listen to their stories. And most of the time, we will find that the differences that exist are by far dominated by what we have in common, our common humanity. And so life becomes far richer if we are open to differences, and that will lead to a better world.
Honestly, I can't think of a better way to end the episode. So I really appreciate your time. Those are important lessons. They're ones that we try to impart in our work, and I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity to have you join us today.
Thank you.
Everyone can make a difference. Never be a witness. Refuse to be enemies. It's hard to think of more clear and concise guidance for our times. I would like to thank Dr. Irene Butter for her time, and thank you for joining us for this premiere episode of Searching for Never Again from the USC Shoah Foundation. If you would like more information about the topics we discussed today, please visit us at sfi.usc.edu. Searching for Never Again is a production of the USC Shoah Foundation, the Casablanca Strategy Group, and Gemini 13. This podcast was created by me, Rob Williams. Barbara Fadita and Keith Suma are executive producers. Will Horowitz is our researcher and producer. Lou Pellegrino is our editor, and Stanley Goldberg's our video editor. Please be sure to like and follow this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.